The airport was bustling with life, families reunited, business travelers rushing to their gates, and tourists navigating their way through the chaos. Among the crowd, Emily stood on her tiptoes, searching desperately for a familiar face. Her older brother was finally coming home after months abroad, and her heart raced with excitement. Then she saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, the unmistakable silhouette of her brother. Without a second thought, she wove through the sea of people, her heart swelling with emotion. As she reached him, she threw her arms around his torso, hugging him tightly, pressing her cheek against his chest. "Oh my God, I missed you so much," she exclaimed. But something felt off. The chest she was hugging was firmer than she remembered, more solid. And the scent, her brother always smelled like old books and fresh laundry. But this man? A sophisticated, woody cologne, rich, masculine, expensive. A sudden wave of panic shot through her. Something was very, very wrong. Slowly, Emily pulled back and looked up. Her stomach dropped. The man she had just embraced wasn't her brother. He was a complete stranger. And not just any stranger, he was strikingly handsome, the kind of man who seemed like he belonged on the cover of a financial magazine rather than in the middle of a crowded airport. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his dark hair neatly styled, his features sharp and defined. But what stood out most were his eyes, a piercing gray, like storm clouds before a thunderstorm. And right now, they were locked onto her with a mix of surprise and amusement. A suffocating silence stretched between them for half a second before Emily stumbled backward, horror creeping onto her face. "Oh my God. I hugged the wrong person. I mean, I got hugged wrong. No, wait, I hugged wrong," she stammered, waving her hands frantically. The stranger remained perfectly still, an eyebrow slightly raised. Well, that was unexpected. Emily wished she could disappear. "I thought you were my brother," she blurted, her face turning an impossible shade of red. "He's tall, dark-haired, and I didn't get a good look." It was the reflection in the glass, the angle, my emotional nearsightedness. The corner of his mouth twitched. Emotional nearsightedness? Yes. When emotions take over logic, and you see what you want to see instead of reality. His gray eyes sparkled with amusement. Before he could respond, a towering security guard in a black suit appeared at his side. "Mr. Carter, is everything all right?" Emily's heart stopped. Carter. Brian Carter. The billionaire. Emily's face burned with embarrassment as she took a shaky step back. Brian Carter. She had heard the name before, who hadn't? He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a financial tycoon who rarely made public appearances. Yet, here she was, making a complete fool of herself in front of him. The security guard's sharp gaze flicked between them, clearly assessing if she was some kind of threat. Emily, a 5'5" barista who struggled to carry 2 coffee trays at once, hardly fit the profile of a danger. "Mr. Carter, should I escort her away?" the guard asked. Emily's stomach dropped. The last thing she needed was to get dragged out of the airport by security. Before she could protest, Brian Carter lifted a hand, signaling the guard to stand down. A slow, knowing smile played on his lips. "There's no need," he said smoothly, his deep voice carrying an effortless authority. "Miss." He paused, waiting for her to fill in the blank. She swallowed hard. "Emily." "Well, Emily, you certainly know how to make an entrance." Emily groaned inwardly. Of course, he was the kind of man who could turn an awkward situation into a charming anecdote. "I swear, I wasn't trying to," she shook her head. "You know what? Never mind." I just need to find my brother and pretend this never happened. Brian tilted his head slightly, his storm gray eyes studying her. I imagine that'll be difficult, considering half the airport probably saw it. Emily's stomach twisted. Great. Just great. She took another step back, desperate to escape this humiliating moment. But as she turned to leave, she felt his gaze still on her. Something about the way he watched her made her skin tingle, not with fear, but with curiosity. What was he thinking? It didn't matter. She was never going to see him again. Or so she thought. Later that evening, Emily returned to her job at the airport cafe. The exhaustion of the day weighed on her, and all she wanted was to get through her shift without another disaster. She was wiping down the counter when a customer cleared his throat impatiently. I asked for a cappuccino with no foam, and this has foam, he complained. Emily bit back the urge to roll her eyes. Another entitled traveler in a hurry. Of course, sir. I'll remake it, she said politely, replacing the drink. The man took it without a word of thanks. Just another day at work. Emily, her manager, called from across the counter. She turned. Yes? There's a special order for table 12. Take it over. Emily grabbed the tray and walked toward the table, weaving through the crowded cafe. When she reached it, her breath caught. Sitting there, in the same impeccably tailored suit, was Brian Carter. A slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. Well, look at that. We meet again. Emily froze in place, gripping the tray a little too tightly. Brian Carter. Again. This had to be some kind of cosmic joke. She had embarrassed herself in front of this man once today. Was fate really giving her an encore? She forced herself to move, carefully setting down his coffee. Here's your order, she said quickly, already planning her escape. But Brian wasn't letting her off that easily. You always run off so fast? He asked, his tone laced with amusement. Emily hesitated, eyes narrowing. Depends. Do you always sit at the same cafe as someone who accidentally hugged you? His lips twitched into a smile. Maybe it's fate. Emily let out a breath, trying not to let her nerves show. Or maybe this airport has limited coffee options. Fair point, he admitted, taking a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving her. Since we keep running into each other, let me ask you something. She folded her arms. If I say no, you're going to ask anyway, aren't you? Brian nodded. Definitely. Emily sighed. Fine. What is it? He leaned forward slightly, studying her with those sharp gray eyes. Did you really mistake me for your brother, or were you just in the mood to hug a stranger? Emily's mouth fell open. What? Brian shrugged, feigning innocence. You seemed pretty comfortable. I might feel special. Emily let out an exasperated laugh. I swear it was a mistake. I had no idea who you were. That's surprising, he mused. She frowned. Why? Because people usually know. His voice was casual, but there was something in it, a weariness beneath the confidence. Emily studied him. He was rich. Powerful. But in that moment, he looked tired. Well, I'm not people, she finally said. Brian tilted his head, intrigued. That much is obvious. Before Emily could respond, her manager's voice interrupted. Emily. Stop chatting and get back to work. She stiffened. Right. I should. Wait. Emily turned back. Brian's expression was unreadable. "I have a deal for you," he said. Emily raised an eyebrow. "A deal? You cook for me. 3 meals a day, for 1 week," he said. "And in return, I'll pay you enough to cover your brother's medical expenses." Emily's heart stopped. She barely knew this man. And yet, in one sentence, he had shattered every wall she'd put up. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Brian's gaze softened, just a little. "Because I can." Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. Then, she made the only choice she could. Deal. Emily had no idea what she was getting herself into. She expected Brian Carter's home to be luxurious, but nothing could have prepared her for the towering glass skyscraper, the private elevator, and the penthouse that felt more like a 5-star resort than an actual home. When she stepped inside, she had to remind herself to close her mouth. The apartment was massive, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city, sleek modern furniture, and a kitchen so pristine it looked like it had never been used. Brian, standing casually by the couch with a cup of coffee, smirked. "Something wrong?" Emily crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous." Brian raised an eyebrow. "What exactly is ridiculous?" She gestured around the penthouse. This apartment, this view, this entire billionaire lifestyle. Do you even use this kitchen?" He took a sip of coffee. "I've walked through it a few times." Emily rolled her eyes. "Great. And now I have to cook in a place that looks like it belongs in a food magazine." Brian leaned against the counter, amusement dancing in his storm gray eyes. "Can you handle it?" She pointed a finger at him. "I take on challenges. But if you become a difficult customer, I'll throw a frying pan at you." He laughed. "Fair enough." A growing connection. The first few days were strange. Emily would arrive early, prepare breakfast, and then spend most of the day in the kitchen while Brian worked in his office. She was expecting to be left alone, but to her surprise, Brian started spending more time with her. At first, he'd just stop by for coffee. Then, he'd linger at the counter, watching her cook. And soon, they started talking. One evening, as Emily chopped vegetables, Brian leaned against the island. "Why did you become a waitress?" She scoffed. "I didn't become anything. I needed a job." He studied her. "And if you could do anything?" Emily hesitated, knife pausing midair. No one had ever asked her that before. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never had the luxury of choosing." Brian was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, he said, "What if you did?" For the first time, Emily wondered if she had spent so long surviving that she had forgotten how to dream. And for the first time, she wondered why Brian Carter, a man who had everything, seemed just as lost as she was. By the 5th day, Emily had almost grown used to the strange rhythm of her new routine. She woke up, made her way to Brian's penthouse, cooked 3 meals a day, and somehow, without meaning to, found herself looking forward to their conversations. Brian was nothing like she had imagined. Yes, he was a billionaire. Yes, he was confident, charming, and frustratingly smug. But beneath all that, there was something else. Something real. And that terrified her. That evening, as she set down his dinner, Brian slid a small velvet box across the counter. Emily frowned. "What's this?" "A dress." She blinked. "A dress?" "I have a charity event tomorrow night," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I want you to come with me." Emily's stomach twisted. "No. No way. She pushed the box back toward him. I don't belong in your world, Brian. He didn't move, didn't insist, just studied her, his gray eyes steady. Then let me bring you into it. Emily swallowed hard. And against her better judgment, she took the dress. The next night, Emily walked into the gala feeling like a deer caught in headlights. The ballroom was filled with designer gowns, diamond necklaces, and people who lived in a world completely different from hers. She took a deep breath, trying to ignore the stares, trying to ignore the whispers. And then, just when she thought the night couldn't get worse, she saw her. Isabella. Tall. Elegant. And absolutely, without a doubt, Brian's ex. Emily barely had time to process before Isabella glided toward them, a glass of champagne in hand. Brian, she purred, her eyes flickering to Emily with thinly veiled disdain. I see you've found someone new. Emily tensed. Before she could say anything, Brian reached for her hand. He intertwined their fingers effortlessly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She's not just someone, Brian said smoothly. She's my guest. Isabella's smile tightened. And just like that, for the first time that evening, Emily felt like she belonged. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of her troubles. It was only the beginning. The night at the gala should have been a dream, an unforgettable moment where Emily, for once, didn't feel like an outsider in Brian's world. But something about Isabella's cold stare and the whispers around her left a lingering unease in her chest. The next morning, Emily walked into the cafe, expecting to return to her normal routine. Instead, she was met with stares. Her coworkers were glued to their phones, whispering in hushed voices. It didn't take long to figure out why. Her name was everywhere. Who is the mystery woman with billionaire Brian Carter? From waitress to heiress? The scandal rocking high society. Gold digger or true love? Emily's stomach twisted. She had never wanted this kind of attention. She turned off her phone, but the damage was done. Her life was no longer just hers. And it only got worse. That afternoon, while she was wiping down the counter, she overheard two coworkers whispering. Did you know Carter's company shut down a bunch of small businesses? Yeah. Including that little restaurant near downtown. The family never recovered. Emily froze. A cold realization washed over her. The restaurant. Her family's restaurant. She hadn't thought about it in years, the place her parents poured their hearts into, the place where she grew up, the place they lost. And now, she was hearing that Brian Carter's company was the reason it had been taken away. Emily didn't think. She acted. She stormed out of the cafe, hailed a cab, and headed straight to Brian's penthouse. When he opened the door and saw her face, he knew something was wrong. Emily? His voice was careful, concerned. She didn't wait. It was you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Your company destroyed my family's restaurant. Brian's face darkened. He didn't deny it. He didn't make excuses. And that hurt more than anything. Emily took a step back, her heart pounding. Was this just a game to you? Emily, listen. No, she cut him off, her voice shaking. I don't want to hear it. And before he could say another word, she turned and walked away. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Emily spent the next several days trying to forget Brian Carter. She threw herself into work, ignored the headlines, and refused to acknowledge the hollow ache in her chest. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the truth. She had trusted him. She had started to feel something real. And now, all of it felt like a lie. Then, one evening, after a long shift at the cafe, she returned home to find an envelope slipped under her door. Frowning, she picked it up and carefully opened it. The moment she saw what was inside, her breath caught. A contract. And attached to it, the deed to her family's restaurant. Emily's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. Brian had bought it back. And he had put it in her name. Emily didn't know what to think. He hadn't called. He hadn't asked for forgiveness. He had just given it back. No strings attached. And that was what unsettled her the most. Brian Carter was a man who never did anything without a reason. So why do this? Why now? The next morning, Emily made a decision. She took the contract and headed straight to Brian's office. The receptionist barely had time to stop her before she marched through the sleek glass doors and into his penthouse suite. Brian was at his desk, looking out over the city, but when he heard her footsteps, he turned. For the first time since she had walked away, their eyes met. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then, Emily took a deep breath and set the contract down in front of him. "Why?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Brian studied her for a long moment, then said simply, "Because it was always yours." Emily's throat tightened. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." He exhaled slowly. "But I wanted to." Silence settled between them. And in that silence, Emily realized something. She had spent so much time being angry, being hurt, being afraid. But standing here, looking at him now, she knew the truth. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want distance. She just wanted him. Emily stood in Brian's office, the weight of the contract pressing against her palms, but the weight in her heart was heavier. She had spent the past few days convincing herself that walking away was the right thing to do. That Brian Carter had no place in her life. But now, looking at him, tired, guarded, but still waiting, she wasn't so sure anymore. She took a slow breath. "You didn't fight me, Brian." He frowned slightly. "What?" "When I walked away," she said, her voice steady. "You didn't chase me. You didn't try to explain. You just let me go." Brian was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, "Because I thought that's what you wanted." Emily's throat tightened. He had given her space, given her time. And instead of trying to win her back with promises or apologies, he had done something far more powerful. He had given her the choice. She glanced down at the contract in her hands. The deed to her family's restaurant. No conditions. No favors. Just a gift from a man who had nothing to gain. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "You could have told me the truth sooner." Brian nodded. "I should have." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to ask the one question that had haunted her. "Was I just a mistake?" The moment the words left her lips, Brian moved. Before she could react, he was in front of her, his hands gently cradling her face. "Emily," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "The only mistake I made was not telling you sooner that I..." He hesitated, his gray eyes searching hers. She knew what he wanted to say. She could feel it. And this time, she didn't run. Slowly, she lifted onto her toes, closing the space between them. And then, finally, she kissed him. The world outside his office faded. The past, the mistakes, the pain, none of it mattered anymore. Because in that moment, Emily knew. She had spent so long fighting the truth. But the truth was simple. She loved Brian Carter. And she wasn't afraid to admit it anymore. Emily never imagined her life would change so drastically. Just weeks ago, she had been a cafe waitress struggling to pay bills, taking care of her younger brother, and trying to stay invisible in a world that never noticed her. Now, she was the woman everyone was talking about. The moment Emily and Brian's relationship became public, the media went wild. Tabloids dissected her past, reporters speculated about her intentions, and social media was filled with people questioning why a billionaire like Brian Carter would choose someone like her. Some headlines were cruel. From coffee to cash, did Emily win the billionaire lottery? Waitress or gold digger? The truth about Brian Carter's mysterious fiancé. Emily had never cared about fame. Now, she couldn't escape it. She tried to ignore it, but the whispers followed her everywhere, at the cafe, at the grocery store, even when she walked down the street. And worst of all, she started doubting herself. Was she really meant to be with Brian? Or was she just another scandal waiting to happen? Brian noticed the shift immediately. One evening, after a long day of avoiding reporters and scrolling past nasty headlines, Emily sat alone at their apartment, staring out the window. She barely heard Brian walk in. But when he sat beside her, she felt the warmth of his presence. He didn't speak right away. He simply reached over, taking her hand in his. "Emily," he said softly, "tell me what's wrong." She hesitated. Then, finally, she whispered, "I don't belong in your world, Brian." He was quiet for a moment. Then, he squeezed her hand. "Says who?" She sighed. "Everyone." Brian turned her toward him, his storm gray eyes filled with unwavering certainty. "You're the only one who gets to decide where you belong." Her breath caught. Then, his expression softened. "And in case you're wondering, I already know where you belong." Emily swallowed hard. "Where?" Brian smiled. "Right here. With me." And for the first time in days, Emily let herself believe it. The restaurant had always been Emily's dream, a place filled with warmth, love, and the echoes of her family's past. Now, after months of work, it was finally ready to open its doors again. She should have been overwhelmed with excitement. But something else had been weighing on her heart. Brian. He had been there every step of the way, helping with renovations, dealing with permits, making sure she had everything she needed. But lately, he had been acting different. Distant. Restless. Emily told herself she was imagining it. That Brian Carter didn't get nervous. Until the night he proved her wrong. The restaurant wasn't officially open yet, but Brian insisted on celebrating. "It's a special night," he had said. "Let's have dinner, just the two of us." Emily had agreed, thinking nothing of it. But when she walked into the restaurant that evening, she stopped in her tracks. The space was softly lit, candles flickering on each table, the scent of fresh flowers filling the air. And there, at the very center of it all, was Brian, dressed in his usual sharp suit, waiting for her with that knowing smile. Emily swallowed hard. Something was happening. They ate, they laughed, they talked about the future. But there was an energy in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place. Then, just as she was about to ask, Brian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Emily's heart stopped. Brian set the box on the table, his gray eyes steady, unwavering. "Emily," he said quietly, "I never expected you I never expected a mistake at an airport to turn into the best thing that ever happened to me." Her breath caught. He took a deep breath. "But here we are." Then, he opened the box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, nothing flashy, nothing excessive, just perfect. Brian exhaled slowly. "Marry me." Emily's world stood still. Not because he was rich. Not because of the ring. But because she had never been more sure of anything in her life. A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "Yes." And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Life's unexpected turns, lessons from Emily and Brian's story. Life often unfolds in ways we least expect. Emily's journey began with a simple mistake, an innocent hug given to the wrong person. Yet, that moment set off a chain of events that changed her life forever. One of the greatest lessons from her story is that opportunities often come disguised as accidents or challenges. What first felt like an embarrassing mishap turned into a connection that reshaped her future. Another powerful message is that true love and genuine relationships are built on trust, growth, and resilience. Emily and Brian faced misunderstandings, social judgment, and personal fears, yet they learned to communicate, to forgive, and to see beyond wealth or status. For those in their later years, this story is a reminder that life doesn't stop surprising us. Whether through love, new friendships, or a second chance at an old dream, there is always room for unexpected joy. So, stay open to life's twists and turns. Sometimes, what seems like a mistake may actually be leading you exactly where you were meant to be.